The rain didn't fall that night, it pressed down, heavy and relentless, as if the sky itself had something to prove. Inside the marble-floored penthouse, everything was still, polished, controlled, until the sound broke through. A briefcase hit the ground, sharp and final. Arthur Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Pack your things," he said, his tone colder than the storm outside. "I don't employ thieves." Across from him stood Elena, her hands trembling, clutching a small plastic container filled with leftover pasta, barely enough for a child, let alone a crime. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, just a quiet breath that caught halfway. Have you ever been judged in a moment where no one asked for your truth? Where everything you were, was reduced to one accusation? Arthur didn't wait for an answer. He turned away, already convinced, already finished. To him, this was simple: rules broken, consequences given. Order restored. But as Elena stepped toward the door, her shoes damp from earlier errands, her grip tightening around that fragile container, something about the silence she left behind lingered longer than expected. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet absence that felt wrong. He told himself it didn't matter. People like her came and went. Replaceable. Invisible. Yet if you had been standing there, watching her hesitate for just a second at the door, would you have asked one question? Just one: why? Or would you have let her walk out into the storm, believing the story you were given? Arthur Vance had everything: money, power, and a life built on precision. Nothing in his world was accidental. Every decision had logic. Every action had a reason. But that night, as the elevator doors closed on Elena's reflection, something slipped through the cracks of that perfect system. Because the scraps she took weren't what he thought they were. And the truth he refused to hear was already unfolding beyond his reach. He believed he was teaching her a lesson. That discipline would correct what he saw as dishonesty. But what if the lesson wasn't hers to learn? What if, in that single moment, he had just turned away from something that could have changed everything? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Arthur Vance lived a life that ran like clockwork, and he liked it that way. Every morning began at exactly 5:30 a.m., no alarms needed, just habit carved into him over years of discipline. His coffee was always black, measured precisely, his schedule mapped down to the minute. Meetings, calls, decisions, everything had structure. Everything had control. It hadn't always been like this. Years ago, before the silence filled his home, there had been laughter, soft music in the evenings, and someone who used to leave the lights on just a little longer than necessary. His wife, Claire, had been the one thing in his life that didn't follow rules. She forgot appointments, burned toast, laughed too loud, but she made everything feel human. When she passed away, suddenly and without warning, Arthur didn't cry the way people expected. He didn't fall apart. Instead, he did something far quieter, and far more permanent. He removed everything that reminded him of unpredictability. Grief became something he managed the only way he knew how, by controlling everything else. Have you ever lost something so important that instead of facing it, you built walls around yourself just to avoid feeling it again? Arthur never said it out loud, but every decision he made after Claire's death carried that same unspoken rule: nothing gets close enough to hurt you again. And people? People were the most unpredictable variable of all. That's why, to him, they were secondary to systems. Replaceable pieces in a much larger structure. Elena, on the other hand, lived a life where structure wasn't a choice, it was survival. Her day didn't begin at 5:30 a.m. because she wanted discipline. It began because if she missed the first bus at 6:10, she'd be late, and if she was late, she risked losing the one job that kept everything else from falling apart. By the time Arthur stepped into his perfectly arranged kitchen, Elena had already been awake for hours. Cleaning. Preparing. moving quietly through spaces that were never hers but that she cared for as if they were. She worked 14-hour shifts without complaint. Not because she didn't feel exhaustion, but because she had learned long ago that some forms of tiredness don't change anything. Her hands told the story her voice never did: small cuts from kitchen knives, faint burns from hot surfaces, skin worn thin from constant washing. And yet, no matter how long the day stretched, no matter how heavy her body felt, there was one moment she never missed. Exactly 6 p.m. Every single day. At first, it seemed like nothing. Just a glance at the clock. Subtle. Quick. Easy to overlook. But patterns have a way of revealing what words don't. At 5:58, her movements would shift slightly. At 5:59, there would be a pause, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And then, at exactly 6 o'clock, her eyes would lift to the clock, just for a second, before she continued working as if nothing had happened. Why 6 o'clock? What was waiting on the other side of that moment? Arthur didn't notice it at first. People like Elena existed in the background of his life. Efficient. Quiet. Unseen. But over time, something else caught his attention. Small things. Insignificant, at least on the surface. An apple missing from the fruit bowl. A sandwich left half-eaten that he was certain had been untouched before. A portion of last night's dinner slightly smaller than he remembered. Individually, each detail was easy to dismiss. But Arthur didn't build his life by ignoring patterns. He paid attention. And once he noticed, he couldn't unsee it. The first time, he said nothing. The second time, he made a mental note. By the third, it wasn't about the food anymore. It was about something deeper. Something that unsettled him in a way he couldn't immediately explain. Betrayal. It was a strong word for something so small, but to Arthur, it wasn't the value of what was taken that mattered. It was the principle. The idea that someone inside his controlled, predictable world had broken the rules without permission. Have you ever felt that shift? When something minor suddenly feels much bigger because of what it represents? That's where Arthur found himself. Not angry. Not yet. But alert. Instead of confronting Elena, he chose a different approach. Quiet observation. Control through information. Within days, discrete cameras were installed throughout the kitchen and service areas. Hidden. Precise. Positioned in a way that ensured nothing would go unnoticed again. It wasn't about the money. The cost of everything missing combined wouldn't even register in his accounts. It was about certainty. About confirming what he already believed to be true. Or at least, what he thought was true. The footage began to tell a story. Elena moved the way she always did, careful, efficient, deliberate. There was no rush in her actions, no sign of someone trying to hide anything. And yet, there it was. One evening, just after preparing dinner, she paused. She looked toward the hallway, listening. Then slowly, almost cautiously, she reached for an apple. Another night, it was a sandwich. Another, a small portion of pasta placed gently into a container. From Arthur's perspective, it was clear. Repeated behavior. Consistent pattern. Evidence. Case closed. But something about it didn't sit right. Not enough to stop him, not enough to question his conclusion, but enough to create a quiet discomfort he couldn't fully ignore. Because what the cameras showed was only part of the story. They captured the moment her hand reached for the food. They recorded the act itself. But there was always a gap, a small, almost invisible piece of time just before it happened that the footage didn't fully explain. A hesitation. A breath. A glance that lingered just a second longer than necessary. Have you ever watched something and felt like you were missing the most important part, even though everything seemed visible? Arthur leaned back in his chair one night, replaying the footage again. frame by frame. Slowing it down. Looking for something, anything, that would confirm he was right to feel the way he did. And then he noticed it. Not what she took, but when. Every single time, it happened just before 6 p.m. Not after. Not randomly. Always before. The same moment she checked the clock. The same moment that, until now, had meant nothing to him. But suddenly, it meant everything. Why would someone risk their job, their stability, over something so small, at the exact same time every day? It didn't make sense. Not in Arthur's world, where every action had a logical explanation. And yet, the answer wasn't in the footage. Because what the cameras didn't show, was what Elena did before she touched the food. And more importantly, who she was doing it for. If you were in his position, what would you believe at this point? Would you trust what you saw, or question what you didn't? Arthur didn't rush it. If anything, he became more patient. Observant. Precise. For 2 days, he said nothing, even as the pattern continued exactly as before. He watched, recorded, confirmed. By the third evening, everything was in place, not just the cameras, but him. Waiting. Silent. Positioned just outside the kitchen where the angle of the lens couldn't reach. The house felt unusually still that night, like it was holding its breath alongside him. At 5:58 p.m., Elena's movements slowed. At 5:59, that same pause. And then, just before the clock turned, she opened the container, this time, not something small or easily dismissed, but a portion of roast beef Arthur had specifically requested for a client dinner. Carefully, almost gently, she placed it into her bag. And that's when he stepped in. "Don't." His voice cut through the room, steady but final. Elena froze. Not startled in the way someone guilty might be, but still, like her body had already accepted what was coming. Slowly, she turned to face him, her hand still resting on the edge of her bag. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Arthur walked forward, each step deliberate, until he stood just a few feet away. "How long?" he asked. No anger. Just expectation. Elena's eyes dropped briefly, not in shame, but in thought, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "Please," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let me take it today." Not an excuse. Not a denial. Just that. Have you ever expected a reaction, fear, panic, apologies, and instead received something completely different? Something that didn't match the story you had already decided was true? Arthur's expression didn't change. "You're asking me for permission," he said, after stealing from me repeatedly. Elena shook her head slightly, not arguing, just correcting something unspoken. "I wasn't," she stopped herself. Not because she didn't have an explanation, but because she seemed to realize it wouldn't matter. Instead, she tried again, her voice thinner this time. "Please. Just this once." Arthur reached for the bag before she could react, pulling it away and removing the container. He placed it back on the counter with controlled precision. "No," he said. That was it. No raised voice. No dramatic accusation. Just a decision made and enforced. "You're done here," he continued. "Pack your things." Elena stood there for a second longer, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the container now sitting just out of reach. And then, something shifted. Not anger. Not resentment. Something quieter, heavier. "Can I at least," she started, her voice catching slightly. She swallowed, steadying herself. "Can I keep that?" she asked, nodding toward the food. Arthur didn't hesitate. No, one word. Final. Unmovable. If you were standing there, watching this unfold, what would you feel in that moment? Would you see a woman facing consequences, or someone losing something far more important than a job? Elena didn't argue again. She didn't plead beyond that single request. Instead, she nodded once, almost to herself, and turned away. Her movements were slower now, heavier, but still controlled. She gathered her things quietly, the small belongings she kept tucked away in corners of a house that was never truly hers. When she reached the door, she paused, not long, just enough to take a breath that seemed to carry more weight than it should. Then she stepped out into the night. This time, there was no container in her hands. Arthur stood where he was, listening as the door closed, the sound echoing faintly through the space. For a moment, he felt something, subtle, unfamiliar, but it passed quickly. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Order had been restored. The problem had been removed. Everything could go back to normal. But normal didn't return. That night, the house felt different. Not quieter, because it had always been quiet, but emptier in a way that didn't make sense. Arthur moved through his routine as he always did. Dinner. Work. A glass of water before bed. Yet small things began to stand out in ways they never had before. The kitchen counters, spotless but lacking something. The faint absence of movement in the early evening. Even the sound of the clock seemed louder than usual, each second stretching longer than it should. Have you ever removed something from your life, convinced it was insignificant, only to realize its absence changes everything? Arthur dismissed the feeling at first. Fatigue, maybe. A disruption in routine. But as the hours passed, the sense of unease didn't fade. It settled. Quietly. Persistently. The next morning, it followed him. He entered the kitchen expecting everything to feel as it always had, controlled, predictable. Instead, there was a subtle disarray. Not mess. Just difference. He reached for his medication, the small routine he followed every day without thinking, and noticed something tucked beside it. A piece of paper. Folded neatly. Arthur paused. He didn't remember leaving it there. Slowly, he picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Familiar. It wasn't a confession. There was no apology. No explanation. No attempt to defend what had happened. Instead, it was a list. Morning, take 1 tablet after food. Evening, half tablet, not before 7 p.m. Don't skip. Even if you feel okay. Arthur stared at the words longer than he expected to. His grip on the paper tightened slightly, not in anger, but in something harder to define. This wasn't what he had anticipated. Not guilt. Not justification. Care. Even after everything, she had left instructions to make sure he stayed well. Why? The question lingered longer than it should have. For the first time, Arthur felt something shift, not enough to undo what he had done, but enough to make him question it. Not the action itself, but the certainty behind it. Because people who act without reason don't usually leave behind reminders for someone else's survival. That's when curiosity began to replace certainty. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. But it was there, growing quietly beneath the surface. Arthur walked back to his office, the note still in his hand, his mind replaying everything he had seen, and everything he hadn't. The footage. The timing. The hesitation before each act. And that one moment that kept returning to him. 6 p.m. Without fully deciding to, he opened his system and pulled up one more detail he hadn't checked before. The company car Elena occasionally used for errands, it had a tracker. Standard protocol. He had never needed to look at it before. Until now. The screen loaded slowly, each second stretching just enough to make him aware of the weight of what he might find. Finally, the map appeared. A small blinking point marking the car's last known route. Arthur leaned closer. She hadn't gone to a bus stop. She hadn't headed toward any of the usual routes that would take her home. Instead, the path extended further. On foot. Street after street, moving away from the city's clean lines and controlled spaces, into an area Arthur rarely thought about, let alone visited. The old industrial district. The name alone carried a certain distance, like a place separated not just by geography, but by everything it represented. Why would she go there? And more importantly, what was waiting for her at the end of that walk? Arthur sat back slowly, the room around him suddenly feeling less certain than it had just hours ago. If everything he believed about her was true, then none of this made sense. But if it wasn't, then what had he just done? Arthur didn't wait long after seeing the route. Curiosity has a way of turning into action when it refuses to quiet down, and for the first time in years, he allowed something unplanned to interrupt his schedule. By late afternoon, he was already in his car, hands steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on directions he had never bothered to explore before. The city began to change the further he drove. The glass towers gave way to worn concrete, clean sidewalks turned into uneven paths, and the quiet order he was used to dissolved into something far less predictable. His SUV moved slowly now, not because of traffic, but because the roads demanded it. Potholes. Narrow turns. People walking too close to the street, carrying lives that looked nothing like his. Have you ever stepped into a place that made you realize how small your understanding of the world really is? Arthur felt it, but he didn't name it. Instead, he focused on the task, convincing himself there was a logical explanation waiting at the end of this drive. Something that would confirm what he already believed. He finally saw her just as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Elena. Walking quickly, her head slightly lowered, her pace steady but urgent. Arthur slowed the car, keeping his distance, watching as she turned into a narrow street lined with aging buildings that leaned slightly as if time had grown too heavy for them to carry. She didn't look back. She didn't hesitate. She moved with familiarity, like someone who had walked this path many times before. And then she disappeared inside one of the buildings. Arthur parked a short distance away, the engine still running for a moment longer than necessary. He stared at the entrance she had just passed through, a structure that looked like it had been forgotten long ago. Faded paint. Broken edges. Windows that told stories without needing words. This didn't match the version of events he had constructed in his mind. Or maybe it did, just in a way he hadn't fully considered. He stepped out of the car, the door closing with a muted thud that felt too clean for the environment around him. As he approached the building, a thought settled in, quiet, but firm. What if this wasn't about survival? What if there was something else going on? A transaction. A network. Something organized. He had seen enough in his world to know that people didn't always act alone. Is she selling it? The question formed clearly now. Is there someone else involved? It made sense. It fit. It restored the order he needed. Because if that was true, then he wasn't wrong. He wasn't the one who misunderstood. He was the one who uncovered the truth. And yet, something about the way she had asked for the food, the way her voice had carried no urgency for herself, only for that one request, didn't quite align with the idea he was holding on to. Still, he pushed the doubt aside. He stepped inside. The air changed immediately. It was heavier. Warmer. Carrying a mix of scents, old walls, damp floors, and something faintly familiar, like food that had been stretched too far. The hallway was dim, lit only by a flickering bulb that seemed to struggle against the shadows it created. Arthur moved carefully, his polished shoes echoing softly against the worn steps as he approached the staircase. Each step upward felt different from the last, not physically, but mentally. The further he climbed, the less certain he felt about what he would find. Halfway up, he heard it. A child's laughter. Soft. Light. Unexpected. Arthur paused. It wasn't the kind of sound he expected in a place like this. It didn't match the tension he had built in his mind. For a brief second, it almost felt normal. And then it shifted. The laughter broke into coughing. Sharp. Repeated. Struggling. Arthur's grip on the railing tightened slightly. Have you ever heard something that changes the way you feel about everything in an instant? Something that forces you to reconsider the story you've been telling yourself? He continued upward, slower now, each step more deliberate than the last. The sound grew clearer as he reached the top floor. A narrow hallway stretched ahead, doors on either side, each one marked with numbers that had faded over time. 4A. 4B. That was it. The door was slightly open. Arthur stopped just outside, his hand hovering for a moment before pushing it further. His mind was already forming the words he would say. The questions. The accusations. The certainty he had carried all this way. He prepared to give her a piece of his mind, but the sight inside snatched the breath right out of his lungs. The room was small. Barely enough space to hold what little it contained. A single bed pressed against the wall. A chair that had seen better days. A small table with items arranged carefully, not out of luxury, but out of necessity. And there, sitting at the edge of the bed, was Elena. She wasn't alone. In front of her sat a boy, no older than 8, his frame thin in a way that spoke of more than just missed meals. His eyes were bright, though, focused entirely on her as she carefully opened a container, the same kind Arthur had seen so many times before. But this time, there was no secrecy. No hesitation. Just care. Slowly, Elena said gently, her voice softer than Arthur had ever heard it. You have to eat slowly, okay? The boy nodded, though his hands moved with quiet urgency as he took the first bite. For a moment, the room felt still again, but not empty, full in a way Arthur couldn't immediately explain. And then the boy coughed again. Elena's expression changed instantly. Concern. Familiar. Practiced. She reached for a glass of water, holding it steady as he drank, her other hand resting lightly on his back, counting under her breath as if she had done this many times before. Arthur stood frozen. Everything he thought he understood didn't fit anymore. There was no transaction here. No exchange. No hidden network. Just a woman, and a child, and a routine built around something far more fragile than he had imagined. His eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in details he hadn't expected to notice. A small stack of medical papers on the table. A prescription bottle with a label partially worn away. A calendar on the wall with certain dates circled, not randomly, but carefully. 6 p.m. Every single day. That was the moment. Not the theft. Not the act. The timing. The reason. Have you ever realized, all at once, that you were completely wrong about someone? Not just a little off, but entirely, painfully wrong? Arthur didn't speak. He couldn't. Because in that moment, standing in a doorway he never expected to reach, he wasn't the one in control anymore. He was the one who didn't understand. And for the first time in a very long time. That terrified him. Arthur didn't step inside right away. He stayed where he was, just beyond the door, as if crossing that line would force him to accept something he wasn't ready to face. From that angle, the room revealed more than it had at first glance. It wasn't just small, it was nearly empty. No proper table. No cabinets. No signs of comfort beyond what was absolutely necessary. The bed he had noticed earlier wasn't even being used in that moment. Instead, Elena sat on the floor. Carefully. Deliberately. In front of her, she had arranged something that stopped him cold. A table that didn't exist. A space on the floor where she had placed the food container, now opened, with portions separated into small, careful amounts. Across from her sat the little girl, Maya, her legs folded, her eyes fixed on Elena with a mixture of hunger and trust that felt far too heavy for someone her age. Beside her, leaning against the wall, was an elderly man, his shoulders slightly hunched, his breathing slow and uneven, but his gaze present. Watching. Waiting. And Elena smiled. Not the kind of smile people use to hide pain. The kind they use to protect someone else from seeing it. "All right," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth Arthur had never once heard in his own home. "Tonight, we have something special." She lifted a small portion of the food, placing it gently in front of Maya first, then another in front of the old man. "The king sent this from his palace," she continued, her tone light, almost playful. "He said we deserved a feast." Maya's eyes lit up, just for a second. A child choosing to believe something beautiful, even if it wasn't real. Arthur felt something tighten in his chest. Have you ever watched someone create a world out of nothing, just to make someone else feel okay? Elena didn't take anything for herself. Not even a bite. Instead, she adjusted the portions again, making them look fuller than they were, spreading them just enough to give the illusion of abundance. Her hands moved with quiet precision, the kind that comes from repetition. From knowing exactly how far something can stretch before it disappears completely. The old man reached forward slowly, his hands slightly unsteady, but before he could take anything, Elena gently touched his arm. "Let her start first," she said, nodding toward Maya. "Respect. Even here. Even now." Arthur's eyes moved again, this time catching something on the table beside them, the medical papers he had only briefly noticed before. Now, from this angle, they were clearer. Dates. Hospital names. Terms he recognized not because he dealt with them personally, but because his company did. Insurance claims. Denied. Multiple times. The realization didn't come all at once. It built, piece by piece, each detail locking into place with a precision that felt almost cruel. The timing. The food. The hesitation. 6 p.m. Dinner time. Not for her. For them. Arthur's breath slowed, but his mind raced. Maya coughed again, softer this time, but enough to draw Elena's full attention. She reached for the water, guiding it carefully, her movements practiced, gentle. This wasn't new. This was routine. Recovery. From something serious. From something expensive. From something that required more than care, it required support. Support that had been refused. Arthur's grip on the doorframe tightened. Because somewhere, in an office far removed from this room, decisions had been made. Numbers calculated. Risks assessed. Claims reviewed. And denied. His company. His system. His rules. Have you ever followed a structure so strictly that you never stopped to question who it might be hurting? The old man shifted slightly, his voice rough but present. "You didn't eat again," he said, not accusing, just noticing. Elena shook her head lightly, brushing it off with the same ease she used for everything else. "I ate earlier," she replied. A lie. A simple one. The kind that keeps other people from worrying. Maya looked up at her then, her small voice breaking through the moment. "Are we going back to the palace tomorrow?" Elena smiled again, softer this time, but with something behind it that Arthur could now see clearly. Hope. Even if it had to be borrowed. "Of course," she said gently. "The king's palace is always open for us." Arthur felt something break, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply enough that it couldn't be ignored anymore. Because the palace she was talking about was his house. The food she described as a feast were his leftovers. And the man she spoke of as a king was him. But not in the way he had ever imagined. In her story, he wasn't powerful. He was distant. Unseen. A figure who provided without knowing. And tonight. Even that had been taken away. Arthur's vision blurred slightly, not from confusion, but from something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Guilt. Raw. Unfiltered. Unavoidable. He thought back to the moment in the kitchen. The way she hadn't argued. The way she hadn't defended herself. The way her only request wasn't for her job, but for the food. And he had said no. Have you ever made a decision so quickly, so confidently, only to realize later that you didn't understand it at all? The weight of it settled fully now. Every missing apple. Every half sandwich. Every small portion he had dismissed as theft. Was survival. Not for her. For them. Arthur's breath caught as the truth finally settled into place. He hadn't just fired an employee. He had taken food from a child. From a recovering child. From a family already living at the edge of everything. And suddenly, the story he had been telling himself, the one where he was the one wronged, the one betrayed, collapsed completely. Because standing there, watching a woman starve herself to make two other people feel like they were okay. He understood something he couldn't ignore. He wasn't the victim. He was the one who caused the damage. The one who enforced rules without asking why they were being broken. The one who had the power to help, and chose not to. Arthur Vance, the man who believed he controlled everything, realized in that moment. He was the villain in a story he thought he owned. And the worst part? No one in that room even knew he was there. No one blamed him. No one accused him. They had simply adapted to his absence. To his decisions. To his silence. Arthur stepped back slowly, the air around him feeling heavier than before, his chest tight with something he could no longer push away. If you were him, standing there, seeing all of this unfold without your presence being acknowledged, what would you do next? Would you walk away, and pretend you never saw it? Or would you finally face what you've done, and try to change it? Arthur didn't think about it any longer. The distance between the door and the truth inside had already done enough damage. Slowly, he pushed the door open the rest of the way, the faint creak cutting through the quiet of the room. Elena turned first, her body tensing slightly, instinctively protective, her hand moving just a little closer to Maya. The old man looked up next, his expression guarded but tired. And Maya, she simply watched, curious, unaware of the weight standing in front of her. For a moment, no one spoke. Arthur stood there, not as the man who owned buildings or controlled outcomes, but as someone who had run out of explanations for himself. Have you ever reached a point where words feel too small for what you've done? Where no sentence feels enough? He stepped forward, slowly, as if anything too sudden might break what little trust existed in that room. His voice, when it came, wasn't controlled anymore. It wasn't measured. It was human. I'm sorry. Just 2 words. No justification. No conditions. No attempt to explain away the past. The kind of apology that doesn't try to fix anything immediately, because it knows it can't. Elena looked at him, searching his face, not for status or authority, but for sincerity. And what she found there wasn't the man from the kitchen. It was someone else entirely. Someone who finally understood what he had done. What would you do in her position? After everything that happened, after being sent away with nothing, after watching your family struggle because of a decision someone else made, how would you respond? Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand answers. She didn't remind him of his mistakes. Instead, she did something that Arthur wasn't prepared for. She reached for a glass, poured water into it, and held it out to him. A simple gesture. Quiet. Unassuming. You should sit, she said gently. Kindness. Not because he deserved it. But because that's who she was. And somehow, that hurt more than anger ever could. Arthur hesitated before taking the glass, his hand unsteady for the first time in years. He sat down slowly, the weight of everything settling in fully now, not as guilt alone, but as responsibility. This wasn't something he could walk away from. Not anymore. Not after seeing what his decisions had done in real terms, to real people, with real consequences. I didn't know, he said quietly, not as an excuse, but as a truth he was ashamed of. Elena nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging. Because whether he knew or not, it had still happened. And that was the part that mattered. The days that followed didn't unfold the way Arthur's life usually did. There was no immediate solution. No quick fix. Real change rarely works that way. But something had shifted, and this time, he didn't try to control it, he followed it. He started with the one thing he had spent years avoiding. Listening. Not just to Elena, but to the details he had overlooked before. Maya's condition. The surgery she needed. The treatment that had been delayed because of denied claims. The old man's history, decades of work under Arthur's father, years of loyalty that ended without security, without recognition, without a safety net. Stories. Not numbers. Not files. Not risks. People. Have you ever realized that the systems we trust the most can sometimes fail the people who need them the most? Arthur went back to his world, but this time, he saw it differently. The offices. The decisions. The processes. All the things he had built his identity around, suddenly looked incomplete. Because now, he understood what they looked like from the other side. And he couldn't ignore it anymore. Weeks turned into months, and for the first time, his work didn't feel like control, it felt like correction. Policies were reviewed. Cases reopened. Not just Maya's, but others like hers. People who had been overlooked, dismissed, categorized too quickly. But Arthur didn't stop there. Because this wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about making sure it didn't happen again. In his late wife's name, Claire, the one person who had once brought warmth into his structured world, he created something new. A foundation built not on profit or efficiency, but on care. Real care. The kind that listens before it decides. The kind that asks questions before it denies answers. And Elena. She didn't return to his house. She didn't go back to being invisible. Instead, she stood at the center of something that finally matched who she had always been. Not as a maid. Not as someone overlooked. But as the director of that foundation. Because no one understood the reality of those decisions better than someone who had lived through them. Maya's condition improved with time, with proper care, with the support that should have been there from the beginning. The old man no longer had to worry about what would happen next. And Elena, she no longer had to count portions or create stories to make survival feel like something more. Arthur still visited. Not as a savior. Not as someone seeking forgiveness. But as someone who had finally learned how to be present. And maybe that was the real change. Because money can build walls, create distance, shape entire worlds, but it can't give something that isn't already there. Not empathy. Not understanding. Not a soul. That has to be found. And Arthur found his, in the one place he never thought to look. Now let me ask you something. If you had never walked into that room, if you had never seen the truth behind someone's actions, would you have done anything differently? And more importantly, is there someone in your life right now, whose story you might be misunderstanding? Now take a moment and really think about this, not as a story, but as a choice. If you were in Arthur's shoes, if you had everything, control, power, certainty, and then suddenly saw the consequences of one decision you made without asking questions, what would you have done? Would you have walked away and protected your version of the truth, or would you have stepped inside that room and faced it, even if it changed how you saw yourself forever? And after everything he did to make it right, do you believe it was enough? Can actions like that truly earn forgiveness, or are some mistakes something a person has to carry for the rest of their life? I want to hear your thoughts. Not just what you think, but what you feel. Because stories like this aren't just about what happened to them, they reflect something in all of us. So tell me, what would you have done differently? And if this story stayed with you, if it made you pause even for a second and see things a little differently, take a moment to support it. Hit that like button, it helps this message reach more people who might need to hear it. And if you want more stories like this every week, stories that stay with you, that challenge you, that remind us what truly matters, make sure you subscribe and stay with us.